Welcome back. So just the transformations we've learned so far give us a lot of power to transform raw data in useful ways. But processes like this usually aren't a one-time thing. Instead, you'll often find yourself needing to apply the same series of steps to new versions of your data over and over again. So does this mean we have to rebuild our Power Query process every single time? Heck no. It turns out that the applied steps listed in the Power Query editor work a lot like an Excel macro. But don't worry if you haven't encountered macros before, you don't need them to use Power Query. Basically, Power Query allows you to play these applied steps back anytime, but against refreshed or updated datasets. So as an example, I've pulled up our raw source data file, our CSV file that we've been importing and transforming via Power Query, and I'm now going to delete a record from this file, just to see if that change is ultimately reflected in our imported data. So I think I'll delete this 6th row here, and then save the file and close it. And now back in Excel, the first thing I want to do is take note of the number of records in our current transformed dataset, 162. So now, to fetch and transform the latest version of the source data file, all I have to do is make sure I've clicked somewhere inside of this table, and then on the Data tab of the ribbon, or on the Table Design Contextual tab, either one, it really doesn't matter, I just click the down arrow under the refresh button and hit refresh. And now if you look at our queries and connections pane, you see that only 161 records are loaded. So basically, Excel not only imported the updated data from our CSV file, it also replayed all the transformation steps that we had applied previously all over again. So the bottom line is, once you've built out your import process, you can reuse it over and over again as long as it still transforms the source data how you need it to. But that does raise the question, what if our data, or what we need to do with our data, changes, and we need to change one or more of our transformation steps? Or even worse, what if we simply made a mistake when we created the process in the first place? Fortunately, Power Query makes it super easy to change our applied steps. Let's take a look at a few examples. Now first, we can go back into our Power Query editor anytime by navigating to the Data tab, then clicking the Get Data button again, and then going all the way down to the Launch Power Query Editor button. So now if we click that, we're right back in the Power Query editor. And Excel even remembers the connection we set up to the external file previously and all the transformation steps we applied to it, as you can see over in our Query Settings pane on the right. So let's say, for example, that we feel like we made a mistake by deleting the square meters column from our source data. Maybe we want that column back. So to remove that applied step, I'll first select it in the Applied Steps list. And one thing I want you to note before we actually remove the step is that if I scroll over to the right until we get to our sale price column, and then scroll down, it looks like we're now seeing sale prices under $500,000 back in our data. But our next step, Filtered Rows, was supposed to take care of that. So what's going on here? Basically, by selecting any of these steps over in the list of applied steps, you're effectively time traveling to that particular step in the process. So any changes made by subsequent steps are not reflected in the data you see when you select a given step. So if I go all the way back to the third step, which is where Excel automatically applied data types to our columns, you see that our column headers no longer have spaces in between them. Our sale price and asking price have not been formatted as currency, and none of the other changes that we applied have been made here. So you can always preview what your data looked like at any point in the sequence of transformations you're applying just by selecting a given step. Now in our case, we want to remove the step where we're removing a column, so we'll select that. And then to remove the step, we just click the X to the left. So here, Power Query is very prudently cautioning us that removing a step that has subsequent steps after it could cause our overall process to break. This is because a later step may reference something that is the output of a previous step, so then if you remove that previous step, the later step breaks. But in our case, we know our last step to filter rows doesn't apply to the column we're removing, so we should be good to go. So I'll go ahead and click delete. And now we see our square meters column is right back in our data. Now if I changed my mind and I wanted to remove that column once more, all I have to do is select the column, choose remove columns, and then if I wanted, I could even move this step back to its original position in the sequence of steps. I would just select the step, then right-click it, and choose Move Before. And now our sequence of steps is exactly what it was previously. Now, in addition to adding and removing steps, we can also edit them in place. For example, let's say we want to change our filter that removes home sales less than $500,000 to be more inclusive, and instead only filter out home sales less than $200,000. Now we could delete our current step and then re-add a modified step, but all that work is not necessary. Instead, we can edit the step in place by selecting it first, and then clicking this little gear icon over to the right. And that brings up the same dialog box we used to apply the filter to begin with. So all I have to do is just change this 5 to a 2, so that we're now just keeping rows where the sale price is greater than $200,000, and then click OK. And now, scrolling down through our sale prices, we see plenty that are less than $500,000, but none that are less than $200,000. So it looks like our edited transformation is working. Now in processes with lots of steps, distinguishing one step from another can prove pretty difficult, since the names that Power Query gives our steps by default are honestly pretty generic. But fortunately, we can also edit the actual names of these steps to make them easier to interpret and easier to distinguish from one another. So let's say, for example, we wanted to make the name of our removed column step more descriptive. First, I would just select that step, and then right-click, and then choose Rename. And then I'll just change the name of that to Removed Square Meters. And then just click out of that. And now our step has been renamed to something that's more meaningful and gives us more insight into what it actually does. And again, we could just as easily go through all these other steps and rename them in ways that make their purpose, their intention more clear. And in general, that's a best practice, especially as the number of steps in your data transformation process grows. You can imagine if you removed multiple columns or changed the data type of multiple columns, suddenly all the versions of change type 1 versus change type 2 would lose their meaning, and it would be harder to figure out which step is doing what, so you could edit them if you need to. Okay, at this point we've pretty much covered the basics of Power Query. Pretty crazy that you can accomplish so much with just a few mouse clicks. But there's still so much more that you can do. Up next, we'll take a deep dive into a set of Power Query transformations we can apply to numerical data. Things like sums, counts, and dollar amounts. I'll see you then.